Now reading from Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 through 53 and 12. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem.
Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed.
We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities.
Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
The passage you just heard may strike you as altogether out of place at a Christmas Eve service. The other Bible passages we've heard are certainly more familiar, at least most of them, if we know the story of Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger. But why would we read such a non-Christmassy portion of the Bible on a night when we're focused so intently on the birth of Jesus? The truth is, this passage, though perhaps less familiar to those who have only heard the accounts from Matthew and Luke, it's absolutely germane to our celebration and remembrance of Christmas and the birth of Jesus Christ. It is not only fitting for Christmas Eve, I dare say it is essential, particularly in this Advent season for our church. During Advent this year, we've been looking at the important role of the prophecies from the Old Testament that predicted the coming of the Messiah. Those herald angels that Luke told us about, those weren't the only voices that told where to find him or what he would be like. The voices of the prophets, especially those of Isaiah and Micah, some 750 years prior to Jesus' birth, told of the coming of a son, a special son, a Savior, who would deliver his people and bring them God's peace. The passage we just heard from Isaiah 52 and 53 is one of those crucial prophecies. In fact, it may be the most important of all of the Old Testament prophecies. From what we can read in the New Testament, we can see that Jesus certainly viewed himself and his ministry through the filter of the figure described in Isaiah's words. And thus it became the filter for the early church and the church throughout the ages to understand what it meant that Jesus was the Messiah, the promised Savior, the one who would deliver his people from darkness and from death itself. This passage is one of four distinct passages in Isaiah that together are known as the servant songs. In many ways, it is both the culmination of the other three servant songs and the key to understanding all of them. We refer to these passages as the servant songs because they introduce a figure who is known as the servant of Yahweh, that is, the servant of Israel's God. And both the context and the content of these songs indicates that this servant is extremely important. For the servant will be the instrument through whom God brings redemption to Israel and to the nations beyond them. Isaiah's portrait thus ties together the promised son of Jesse and this servant. And the central question then for all of these passages is, well, who is the servant? Well, that's easy, some would say. Isaiah 41, 8-9 clearly identifies Israel as God's servant. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth. From its farthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you. I have not rejected you. So the servant of Yahweh, this crucial figure, well, it must be the people of Israel considered as a whole. Except that there are times in these four songs, as we see in the passage from chapters 52 to 53, that the servant is someone who is distinguished from the people of Israel. And that's true even in the immediate context of Isaiah 41, 8-9. In fact, in chapter 53, the servant is someone who carries their sins in himself in order to take them away from Israel. How can the nation carry their own sins away from themselves? No, Isaiah says that He took up our pain. He bore our sufferings. He was wounded, pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. He was cut off from the land of the living because of the sins of my people, the people Israel. The servant is not the nation. The servant is the one who is suffering for the sake of the nation. It is in Him that all of Israel's suffering and pain and sin and death are taken away, and not just Israel's, but the nations of the world. For the servant is the one who, Isaiah says, will sprinkle many nations, and the verb there is very important. It is a direct reference to the sprinkling of the blood of the sacrificial lamb on the altar of God. The blood that represented the atoning death of God's sacrifice for His people. He is the one who justifies the many. It is through His suffering that others are freed from the guilt that has come upon them because of their sins. This servant who has come to redeem His people and to bring the light of the knowledge of God to the rest of the world, He completes His mission through His own suffering on their behalf. By His wounds, Isaiah says, we are healed. And that's a verse that the Apostle Peter quotes in his letter in the New Testament, speaking of the death of Jesus on the cross as the fulfillment of the prophecy about the servant from Isaiah's lips 8 centuries earlier. Many years ago, my sister gave me a gift. It was a set of 12 charcoal drawings made by an artist she'd met named C. Beck. I gave 11 of the drawings away to a missionary. Unfortunately, he lost them, which was really sad. I did keep one, which was my favorite. In each of the 12 drawings, there is a point where the artist very subtly seizes your eye and shows you the key to understanding the picture. For instance, in one of the drawings, he shows the deliverance of the man Jesus met who had a legion of demons. And the narrative in the Gospels describes the demons leaving the man and going into a herd of pigs. And that herd of pigs then stampedes down the side of the hill into the lake and they're drowned. Well, in Mr. Beck's picture, you see the pigs rushing down the hillside. And the hillside is actually the side of the man's face. And in his expression, you see this man right where he is, in between his life of demonic torment and this new life. He's just starting to feel the freedom that Jesus has given him. Well, my favorite picture from this collection is a very simple one. But there are three very clear and defining moments, if you will, when you look at the picture. The first moment is when you see the most obvious part of the picture. It's a baby's face, with the most delicate suggestion of his mother's hands holding him. And the softened edges of the charcoal accentuate the perspective that's taken by the artist to draw us in. He invites us to really look at the face of this baby, which is the focal center of the picture. It is as if we are looking at the baby through the eyes of his mother. He's brand new, just moments old. His head is still misshapen from birth. He's utterly dependent, so very weak and so very small. How do I know it's a boy, you ask? Well, that's a fair question. And that leads us to the second moment. Because the second moment is when you notice the title of the picture. Fortunately, you can't see the title in the picture that I took of the drawing, so I've blown it up for you. It's "He Came into His World." Now we know the identity of this baby, because he is that baby. He's that baby, the one who created the world and who has now come into this world to be a part of it, who has come to be one of us. This is that baby, the Christ child, the Son of God, the eternal one wrapped in swaddling cloths. But the third moment is the most important one. That's when you look deeply into the baby's eyes. His mother is looking at him, but he's looking elsewhere. And there in each eye, in the center of his pupils, is a cross. And if you look closely, you can see that there is someone on that cross. He came into his world. And from the moment he emerged from Mary's womb, his purpose was clear. The end to which he was heading, the goal of his life, the reason for his birth, they were all there, all in front of him, and his eyes were fixed upon that cross from the start. The Apostle John said that the reason that the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. That's 1 John 3:8. Well, he did that, not with an army of angels, but all alone on a cross, where he bore the guilt and the punishment for the sins of all humanity for all time. For you, for me. The servant, the Messiah, the promised one from God, was born in obscurity and need. Isaiah said, "We didn't esteem him at all," though he was the most honored of all God's servants. The baby Jesus was placed in a manger, not so that we would pity him, but because his path would lead not to worldly glory and fame, but to a cross, where he would pour out his life for transgressors, for wanderers who had all lost their way, for poor, ordinary people like you, like I, who desperately needed a Savior. One of the reasons we have a special service on Christmas Eve is to help us pause in our rush to get to Christmas and remember why this birth matters so much, why we celebrate the birth of this baby. You see, when we think of Christmas, we naturally tend to think of Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger. We think of the picture from the nativity sets, where the Son of God lies in a feeding trough. When God thinks of Christmas, He thinks of a cross, where His Son hung between heaven and earth, poured out His life's blood to bridge the gap between heaven and earth, to make a way for us to be right with God, to finally be put right. God's Christmas gift to the world was His Son, the suffering servant, promised to us 8 centuries earlier in Isaiah's prophecy. He is God's gift for you as well.